You are tuned to Macro TV. We are busy with the basic model of macroeconomics in Study Unit 2 and Chapter 3 in Fourier and Berger. This is video number 10 of 10 covering the contents of Chapter 3. Now, we've already talked about the IS LM model and how you can move IS and LM around to model policy changes, for example, an expansionary monetary or fiscal policy. Now, in this last video, we basically want to talk about policy effectiveness. So the effectiveness of monetary or fiscal policy depends on the slopes of the IS and the LM curves. And we already know which factors influence those slopes. So if there is a change in incomes, by how much does that change the money demand? Or if there is a change in money demand, by how much does that change interest rates? And those two determine the slope of the LM curve. In a similar fashion, if there's a change in interest rate, by how much does investment change? And if there's a change in investment, what does the expenditure multiplier look like? These factors influence the slope of the IS curve. And we can take you through an example showing differences in impact of a specific policy depending on these slopes. So let's say that there's a real money supply increase, expansionary monetary policy from the Reserve Bank side. We know that this moves the LM curve to the right and it increases income and reduces the real interest rate. We explained that in the video number 9. But the size of these changes, in other words, how well the policy works, is going to depend on the slopes of the curves. In this figure 3.23, you get the idea that if the LM curve is relatively flat, it implies a certain change in interest rates and incomes that differs from a steep LM curve that has a different kind of change of both interest rates and income. And you can see in this case, if the LM is flat, there's a small change in interest rates and a small change in incomes. Where if the LM curve is slightly steeper, you'll have a bigger change in interest rates and incomes. Now, let's look at monetary stimulus and the influence of the IS curves. Now, the IS curves can also be steep or flat, and you can see the monetary stimulus kicking in over here, moving the LM curve towards the right. Let's first do the flat IS curve. So starting from equilibrium over here, the new equilibrium ends up at this point, and you can see it's a relatively small drop in interest rates that generates a large increase in output. So in that sense, a flat IS curve is good for expansionary monetary policy, where if the IS curve is quite steep, you have to decrease interest rates a lot and only get a small increase in output. Now, this makes sense. A flat LS curve is associated with investment that is very sensitive to interest rates. So a small change in investment causes a large increase in investment, and also with a large multiplier. So that large multiplier kicks in and it increases output by a lot. The opposite is true if the IS is steep. Then investments don't really react to interest rates and the multiplier is small and the impact of policy is also limited. So for monetary policy to achieve a larger effect, the LM should be relatively steep and the IS should be relatively flat. We can also talk about the effectiveness of fiscal policy. We know that an increase in government spending moves the IS curve to the right and it increases the equilibrium income, but also pushes up the interest rate. Now the size of this again depends on the slopes. In this case, we have our two IS curves before and after the increase in government spending. Government spending moves the IS towards the right. Now, the slope of the LM curves influence the impact of that spending. And you can see, let's start over here, where we have the relatively flat LM with equilibrium at this point. And you can see if the LM curve is relatively flat, you have a large increase in output associated with that increase in government spending, and the increase in interest rates is not particularly high. But if the LM is steep, you'll only get a small net increase in output from the original fiscal stimulus, and you get a large increase in interest rates over on the vertical axis. There's a stronger crowding out effect with the steeper LM curve. So again, if fiscal policy is to have a great effect, the LM should be relatively flat and the IS should be relatively steep. Now, if you put our two slides on this together, it shows something that's quite worrying. So for monetary policy to have a large effect, LM must be steep and IS flat. For fiscal policy to have a large effect, LM must be flat and IS must be steep. And this tells us that it's very difficult to simultaneously have a very stimulating monetary policy and also very stimulating fiscal policy. They tend to work against one another depending on the slopes of these curves. In conclusion, you can see that there are differences in policy effectiveness depending on the slopes of the IS and the LM curves. Now, this is the final video covering the contents of Chapter 3. And at this point, you really need to go and revise. You need to make sure that you're comfortable with the IS and the LM curves and the different factors that move them around, the interactions, the primary and secondary effects, because from Chapter 4 on, it gets complicated. We add the foreign sector, which means we have exports and imports, the balance on the balance of payments, and that also feeds into exchange rates and the money supply. So the picture gets quite complicated. Please use these videos for some revision, and we'll talk again in Chapter 4.